Dwight Williams, and Dwight is active over there in the Saginaw Tourist Club, and he's just come to bring some greetings to us. And Dwight, I'll ask you just to speak for yourself here.
I have a very large voice, so I don't think I need the mic. Oh, you need it for your... Okay. I have a very large voice, but I'm being soft right now. And I'm delighted to be here. You folks are very friendly. I can't tell you how much I enjoy the Torch experience, and it's a pleasure to be here. My good friend Jim, we're in communication, and he told me about the talk he was going to give. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but it sounds very interesting to me. That was one of the reasons I came. And the other reason is I know you folks had a bad experience with the International Association about 4 years ago. And I want to assure you that things are changed. For instance, the horns are gone. Thank you very much for letting me come.
Right. We'll go around here, and since we're at this table, do we have any other guests, Jim?
She said she's not a guest, but this is my wife, Joan, and she's been here a few times, so glad to have her with me tonight.
Yes. And as I walk around, yes, Len, you have a guest.
I have another, not a guest. This is my wife, Linda. Linda.
All right. Do we have a guest at our table over here, David, that you care to introduce? Yes.
She flew the scoop, but this Dara Strauss is sitting right over there in the limelight. But yeah.
And others, guests, apparently not. All right. So we're here with the evening program. Just a reminder, if you have not paid your second installment on your dues, Joe Fugate would hate to go home empty with an empty wallet. So if you still owe him some money, you know where he's at. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. You all know Jim. He's been our longtime secretary. He sent me his biography and told me I should embellish it, but after downloading 5 pages, I didn't think there was any real need to. But I do have just a little bit of background on Jim, and most of you probably have heard this already because Jim has given us any number of interesting talks over the years. But Jim is a graduate from Western Michigan. He has his bachelor's in printing management and business. He worked, of course, in advertising at the Kalamazoo Gazette for many years, marketing director, advertising director, a variety of posts like that. In 2001, he split off from the Gazette, organized his own business, Quadrant II Marketing, as a boutique advertising, marketing, and public relations agency. In addition to that, he is engaged as a professional photographer doing stock photography I suspect, mostly in nature because Jim loves the natural sciences. He spends a lot of time outdoors. I think many of us have seen some of Jim's photographs in the past, so he has really been pursuing that. And of course, as we found out once again tonight, he is fortunate to have Joan as his wife. And they have 3 grown children, 5 grandchildren. And Jim is going to talk to us tonight about some social polling, social analysis, social tracking in England, starting in the 30s, as I recall, Jim. Right. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim. I think we have to.
Yeah, don't stand in front of the speaker.
I was too close to it. That's just to wake everybody up. So that was not an accident. That was planned. in Britain during the 1930s, and you're right, it was in the 30s, there were two distinct social classes, the elite and the working class. And the elites were concentrated in the southern part of the country, and the working class primarily in the northern industrial areas. Elites dominated the economy and government. And these were also turbulent times. Europe witnessed the Spanish Civil War. Hitler and the Nazi movement was on the rise, and a popular king, Edward VIII, abdicated his throne to marry an American divorcee. And the world continued to suffer the hardships of the Great Depression. And these events were on the minds of all Brits. Yet what regular Brits, regular people, thought about or felt about these topics was neither recognized or really even understood. News and gossip have been social currency since the beginning of civilization. People want to know what's happening and gauge how it might affect them and others. The problem is discerning what and whom to trust. Sources distribute information and people assess its credibility. Consumers of news judge the validity of what they hear and form attitudes, opinions, and beliefs. And those attitudes and beliefs stimulate behavior. Collective opinion is the catalyst for policy. Public opinion influences officials, institutions, and policymakers. So tonight, I'm going to provide a history of what is called the Mass Observation Project, which was an endeavor to know the thoughts and feelings and opinions of Brits at that time. And I'll also attempt, I didn't put attempt in there, but I know it's going to be an attempt, to also equate those times with the cultural and political divide that's in our country today. So, in September of 1936, Jeffrey Pike, and he was a Cambridge schoolmaster, published an article in the New Statesman on what he termed myth in national politics. 3 months later, the magazine published a second letter by Pike regarding the abdication crisis, in which he suggested an anthropological study of British society. And Pike stated, and I have here, and there'll be a couple others that are fairly lengthy quotes, so I'll try to let you know when the quote ends and when I start. But here's what Pike stated at the time. He said, anthropologists and psychologists all over the world are studying the reactions of primitive tribes to sexual situations. There has been concentrated within the last 10 days the reactions of the people of the British Empire to a sexual situation. Here, in a relatively limited form, is come the material for that anthropological study of our own situation, of which we stand in such desperate need. And then in a paper titled Mass Observation, A Short History, by a fellow by the name of Tom Jeffrey, Jeffrey claims the abdication crisis launched the Mass Observation Project. And it reads, and this is the longer quote, but there's some things in there that I think we can come back to a couple of times as we discuss not only this study, but the ramifications for us. It read, the abdication crisis is the immediate cause of the founding of MO, which is mass observation, and illustrates three of mass observation's fundamental concerns. Firstly, a fascination with what they call myth and superstition in national life, especially in relation to public fears and fantasies about the coming of war and relation to royalty. Secondly, a deep distrust of the press and criticism of the inability of the press to fulfill its supposed function, that is, to bridge the gap between rulers and ruled, and to tell the public the moves and thoughts of its elected leaders, and to tell the leaders the opinions of the electorate. During the abdication crisis, the press had imposed self-censorship. Pages had been torn out of foreign magazines before they reached the public. The Prime Minister, Baldwin, was publicly silent until the eve of abdication, and the public wanted the facts and got nothing but rumor. Conversely, Baldwin and his government were worried about the public reaction to the crisis. The war in Spain had just broken out earlier that year, and the government was loath to encourage the formation of a faction of the king's friends. The government needed, therefore, to be able to gauge public opinion, but the organs which should have expressed public opinion, the press, were seriously out of touch with their readership. This brings us to the third fundamental concern of mass observation, the great gulf of ignorance, dividing rulers from ruled and class from class. In February 1937, M.O. wrote, and he's quoting then another article here, it says, as a result of the abdication crisis, we realize as never before the sway of superstition in the midst of science. How little we know of our next door neighbor and his habits, of conditions of life and thought in another class or district, our ignorance is complete. The anthropology of ourselves is still a dream. That's the end of that long quote. But sound familiar? All right. Pike's letter in the New Statesman inspired three people in particular. One was Tom Harrison, who had recently returned from a 2-year anthropological expedition living among a cannibal tribe in the New Hebrides. He settled in the English industrial town of Bolton, which he later nicknamed Worktown. In Bolton, Harrison began a project to observe the cultural, political, and daily life of Britain's industrial class, and it's worth noting that Harrison was a renowned ornithologist, a bird watcher, and his approach to bird study was to observe birds in their natural behavior without being detected. So I threw that in there because that may come back a little bit. And he was one of the founders. The second key figure was Charles Madge, a left-leaning poet. In response to Pike's letter, Madge published a piece in the New Statesman to announce that several poets, painters, and documentary filmmakers from London had established an organization, quote, intended to create a new science of ourselves, mass observation. Harrison read Madge's letter and contacted Madge to inform him about his Worktown project, and thus a collaboration was initiated. Humphrey Jennings, a photographer and filmmaker, was the third person instrumental in founding mass observation. In January of 1937, a letter signed by all three appeared in the New Statesman to announce the formation of mass observation and to solicit sponsors and volunteers. So, let's see if I can get this back up. One moment. I thought if I had it on sleep, I wouldn't have to enter the code again. There we go. So, with the support of sponsors and volunteers, the Mass Observation Project began in September of 1937 as a sociological and anthropological study of the British people. And it utilized an assortment of research methods to collect and analyze an all-encompassing range of data to assess public opinion. And then this is what they call the nature and scope, but this nature and scope graphic provides the components for data collection and the project and its end products. It really takes a bilateral a bilateral approach, because mass observation deployed two primary methodologies of data collection. And the first was what they call topic collection, to watch, listen, and document observations. And the second, personal writing, the collection of documents from study participants in the form of diaries and surveys. So topic collection the one on the right, topic collection utilized paid researchers to conduct structured investigations. As for topics, MO leaders reviewed magazines and daily newspapers to identify themes and subjects. And they wanted to know if these topics came up in general conversation, by whom and what was said. And in mass observation, sent these investigators, they sent them into workplaces, marketplaces, pubs, churches, meeting and gathering places, and mass transit to listen and absorb. Again, observers took precautions to mingle and surreptitiously listen to conversations around them without engaging and file written reports. Harrison was a proponent of attendant observation, where the observer remains unobserved. This approach was likely an extension of Harrison's birding technique and refined while he lived among and studied the New Hebrides tribe. Harrison's primary mass observation project, again, was concentrated in Bolton. There he directed observers into streets, pubs, factories, marketplaces, to blend in and observe and eavesdrop on conversations and interaction. Harrison believed if one were to directly ask someone's opinion, the response may not actually reveal the respondent's genuine persuasions. Observers were encouraged to also to gather minutiae. For example, at pubs, observers recorded the name of the establishment, the date and time, how many patrons were there, and counts for the number of men and women and approximate ages, whether they were at a bar or table, if music, song, or dance were being played, or games. And over time, they also tracked regulars in what friendship groups formed. And I think the other context, and I didn't want to get in a side shoot here to discuss this, but also when you talk about the United Kingdom and Britain and pubs really were a central social gathering place. It wasn't like the bar, like we're going to go to, a bar downtown and have a couple of drinks. This is where people came and they talked and they caught up on news and all sorts of things and sat and chatted and conversed. So it was really a powerful mechanism, and so an ideal source to begin gathering what people's candid thoughts and feelings and beliefs were. Madge was not opposed to questionnaires and surveys, and his work included both. A variety of questionnaires were utilized, including in-person interception and door-to-door gathering of surveys. Now the other side, the left side here, personal writing, is most widely associated with mass observation project. A national panel of volunteer observers from across the country submitted daily diaries. An early version, launched in 1937 by Madge, was the day diary to collect detailed personal accounts on the 12th of each month. More than 500 people self-reported details of their day and their thoughts from morning till night. A year later, rather than doing it on the 12th day of every month, day diaries were only kept for special days and holidays. Here's another key that worked two ways. Survey participants were given anonymity in exchange for mass observations, sole possession, and perpetual rights to these submissions. As researchers administered submissions, they cataloged each by date and location, the diarist's gender, age, and occupation. The personal writings and diaries were faithfully kept for many years by a large percentage of the participants, most of whom were women, because men typically worked long hours or soon after they were away at war. The fact that Britons were well educated and literate contributed to the astute introspection and quality of the diary collection. As an example, here's a quote from an observer's report during the observance of 2 minutes of silence on Armistice Day November 11th, 1937. And here's the quote. Every man was still in the position in which they had been working. Some men were standing, caps in hand. There was a man bending down, his head bowed. There was another man standing on the machine where he had been loosening or tightening the bolts, holding the job on the machine. No one seemed to have their eyes closed, so I did not close mine. Anyhow, I wanted to see what impressions I could gather. A feeling of reverence swept the building and filled the atmosphere. For 2 short minutes, human beings who were literally part of the machines they were working on brought themselves back to men again. And that's the kind of writing that was gathered in those diaries. The next, and it's on this left side as well, were the directives, and the third form was directives in the form of documents. And MO observers received topics to gather open-ended responses of opinions and thoughts. Many of these directive questions centered on civilian adaptation to wartime conditions, in particular food and clothing, rationing, evacuation of children, air raids, housing, transport, conscription, war work, separation from loved ones, and health, and so on. Many of the topics were repeated between 1939 and 1945 to measure fluctuations in some of these opinions. And some directives focused on general topics such as race, health, marriage, sex, and hopes and fears. More than 3,000 people participated over those 6 years. And I'll come back to a sample. I have a sample of one of the directives to have you take a so you can see what those are. So, what was learned from mass observation? The data collected from mass observation was massive in both quantitative and qualitative. The quantitative data was straightforward in terms of analysis. The qualitative material, the diaries and the narrative reports, was more complex and subjective, and qualitative data were compiled into summary reports. While the diaries, open-ended questionnaires, and narratives presented obstacles to analysis, they provided rich first-person observations, often in great detail. Researchers attempted to quasi-quantify the subjective information by counting the number and frequency of specific words and terms, and then track kind of correlations to demographics to these. So they were trying to mine those for a little bit more information. File reports, next to the top on here. There were thousands of file reports were produced by mass observation. For example, MO file report number 22 provides details of newsreels from the beginning of World War II to January of 1940, and they cite dates, subject, newscast personalities, and reactions to the newsreels via audience questionnaires. MO documents are now housed in an archive at Sussex University in Brighton, England, and in 2005 the collection was given what they termed designated status as a preeminent collection of national and international importance. And books, that was the pinnacle of mass observation's nature and scope, where that was their overall goal. Roughly a dozen books were published on collected data. They include May the 12th Mass Observation Day Survey, which chronicles the entire day by a collection of survey submissions. Then written by Mass Observation, Women in Wartime, Hubs and the People, and others. Harrison and Madge, those two founders, Harrison and Madge co-authored a book in 1939 titled Mass Observation Britain, and in one chapter, Crisis, they chronicle shifts in public opinion related to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's negotiations with Hitler in Munich in 1938. and Chamberlain's Declaration of Peace in our time. And while the population was thrilled with the news that war had been prevented, they did not know the terms of the agreement. And as that became known, public opinion quickly turned. But fortunately, mass observation was already in place, so it measured that change and that movement and that public opinion as information got out. So that was, I think, a very important part. In The Listener, September 22nd, 1938, Hugh Gray, a Labor Party politician, wrote, and here's another long quote, but we'll pull some things out of this as well. "This week, as never before during the whole history of broadcasting, the people of this country have listened in for news and information. Two speeches stand out. They are the recorded statements of Mr. Chamberlain before leaving for Germany and on his return. In a time of conflicting rumors and divergent opinions, and in the natural absence of any comprehensive official statements, they did something which revealed once more the possibility of wireless. They allowed us to gather impressions from the tone of the speaker's voice. But what else are we being given? Certainly less than we might reasonably have expected. I do not suggest for one moment that we should ask for news that could not wisely be given. I do not ask for propaganda or personal statements. Surely, though, it should be possible to broadcast even one talk explaining as simply as possible the facts about the Czechoslovakian problem. Isn't this where broadcasting should come to our help at a time when each individual is called upon to make up his mind on matters and to come to a decision, the consequences of which are unpredictable?" He goes on, 5 minutes in the street or the tube, listening to people talking are sufficient to show that the majority are extremely vague about issues involving Czechoslovakia. What is the value of a democratic vote when the demos is ignorant? And I think that was really a key point. In that same book that I reference, the authors also include 2 chapters about 2 odd subjects. Chapter 4, All In and All Out, is about the popular sport of freestyle wrestling. You know, going on a Friday evening to go out and watch 2 people kind of get into it and see who was going to win, but that was freestyle wrestling. And Chapter 5, Doing the Lambeth Walk, looks at a dance craze called the Lambeth Walk. These 2 cultural phenomena were associated with the working class and scorned by the social elites. Harrison and Madge recognized these conflicting societal and cultural viewpoints as manifestations of disharmony between the 2 groups. They speculated, based on interviews, that the negative opinions of the elites towards these popular trends actually engendered stronger collective allegiances in support of these pastimes by the working class. And there's a quote in here that I've added to this. Breaking conventions is silly from the point of view of those keeping them. And conversely, keeping conventions is silly from the point of view of those breaking them. So what can we learn? What can we learn from mass observation? The Mass Observation Project was a foundational anthropological study to comprehend what British people thought and felt about any number of topics. Prior to the study, as I said, there was no viable means to acquire accurate insight. One could make a case that this gap in perception is and has long been part of our current social dynamic. For example, the rise of the Tea Party, and more recently, Trump supporters, Antifa, and Black Lives Matter. Despite the surging emergence of media outlets, the web, social media, and 24/7 access to information and individual comments, emails, text, videos, Facebook, Twitter, It's a cacophony of garbled background noise lacking context, interpretation, and reliability. A record majority of the public does not trust what they hear from media, government, business, industry, academia, and now even science. The byproduct of confusion and mistrust confounds receptivity towards news. The prevalence of cancel culture, political correctness, and strident special interest groups gives cautious pause to individuals, politicians, businesses, and organizations to share their views. There are many examples of this reluctance, as illustrated by an incident which gave rise to what was labeled the Bradley effect. In 1982, LA Mayor Tom Bradley ran for governor of California, and polls indicated he was favored to win. Bradley lost by a significant margin, and the term Bradley effect was coined by pollsters to describe why survey participants chose not to provide candid responses. And a more technical term that they now use for that is socially desirable bias. The people who are giving the survey what they think is probably the right answer that they're looking for. In 2006, the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, Proposal 2, to stop discrimination by publicly funded institutions, was on the ballot. Its purpose was to prohibit affirmative action. 2 weeks from the election, the Detroit Free Press poll found that 41% were in favor, 44% opposed, and 15% were undecided. The proposal was expected to fail. However, the proposal passed 58 to 42, a dramatic divergence from poll predictions. Perhaps this is synonymous with the silent majority. You're familiar with that term, a term that was also coined during the politically turbulent 60s. More recently, David Graham, a staff writer for The Atlantic, published an article in that magazine on November 4th, 2020, just the day after our last presidential election, titled, "The Polling Crisis is a Catastrophe for American Democracy. If public opinion data are unreliable, we're flying blind." Graham states, here's a quote from out of that article, "The real catastrophe is that the failure of the polls leaves Americans with no reliable way to understand what we as a people think outside of elections, which in turn threatens our ability to make choices or to cohere as a nation." End of quote. So, and every respected polling research organization failed to predict the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and they were off by a wide margin in the most recent election in 2020. I think the key here that they saw in the 30s, and I think we're seeing today, is that in a democracy, individuals have a vote. Attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, and opinions determine how they vote. Tom Peters, in his book, Thriving on Chaos, A Handbook for Management Revolution, states, relative predictability is deficient. Peters rhetorically asked in that book, who could have predicted the fall of the Soviet Union? Despite all the sophisticated intelligence organizations and gathering methods, yet attitudes and rationalizations had to have been in place to lead to such dramatic action. But no one had a clue what was on the minds of Soviet leaders, let alone the Soviet people at that time. The rise of restricted open speech through social media, shaming, harassment, cancel culture, and other personal sanctions in retaliation to offensive language or whatever it may be, constrains expression of candid thoughts and opinions. Thus, many people turn to safe environs to get and share information, further dividing people into groups with shared values and opinions. And these safe groups are exposed only to their own orthodoxy and rarely to any countervailing views. So, as the founders of Britain's Mass Observation Project recognize, the profound deficiency in knowing the mindset of a vast portion of society, we too are in the same predicament. The MO founders appreciated the fact that not understanding the values, beliefs, and opinions of a huge cultural and political force was more than a communication void. It carried the risk of social and political chaos. Not comprehending the perspectives and aspirations of the people with the right to vote opens the possibility of unexpected results. And as Barack Obama famously said, elections have consequences. So I conclude the brilliance of the Mass Observation Project does not lie in any set of observations, rather the mass of data collected firsthand from thousands of sources over an extended period of time with personal anonymity to motivate candor provided a three-dimensional representation of collective or public opinion. And those three dimensions being the occurrence and frequency of a particular opinion, the degree to which it is held, and its durability. Further, there exists a social dynamic that when people perceive their opinions are scoffed, criticized, mocked, it catalyzes a cohesive force to bind those who embrace those views more closely together. And some may label this tribalism or nationalism, right? But it's motivated, it's a desire to protect and defend a common bond which sharpens and strengthens positions and divides. To understand people's beliefs and attitudes as a guide for suitable representation, we, as a society, must conduct our own anthropological study and conscientiously listen to the people and cultivate open and honest dialogue. Mass observation taught us to listen first and then comprehend what is observed for context and understanding. So I suggest an ongoing mass observation study of our own on a national as well as personal scale. Britain's Mass Observation Project's greatest legacy may be the template it constructed for understanding the engine and the fuel of a democracy, its people. Our founders recognized its import and placed freedom of speech as the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So with that, I'll take your questions. John.
Would you call MO a massive sociological study, to use terminology of the day?
Yes.
Okay. How many researchers were involved in that effort, and who in the world funded it?
That's a good question. I don't have that information in detail. I've seen it. I didn't pull it out, but there were hundreds and hundreds of volunteers and paid observers. And what kicked it off is when they were published those early articles to announce this in the New Statesman. They weren't just looking for volunteers; they were looking for sponsors, and they did get sponsorships of that. So I know that's in some of the material that I have, but I don't have that specific information. And not just to get this thing going, but to sustain it. And then as all this was being gathered and it was being sent in and gathered, someone had to administer this material and catalog it. And Sharon, you know what a massive project that would be. You know, so it had quite a few people behind it and supporting it.
But Jim, it's interesting, but my first question is probably more historical. Was the British government aware of all of this information? Were they able to keep track of public opinion? And I ask that because in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the respective political parties themselves were trying very hard to track public opinion. So I'm wondering, was the British government able to use this information to pursue its policies as, I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's comparable in terms of its intent, but
But I do recall reading, Tom, I do recall reading where there was some information that was just not able to be divulged. And maybe that had to do with air raid shelters and food and some things like that. But whether or not the government actually had access to this, I would imagine they would, because there were so many reports that were being printed and published on that, and some of the books came out very quickly after it began. So I would imagine they were seeing some of that. Right?
As a scientist, I always have to ask, how was this validated? Is there any evidence that the MO project was more valid than today's political pollsters, for example?
I did not tip him off to ask that question. I didn't bring him here as a shill. Let me show you this. I'll show you one thing that caught my eye. Will that come in focus? Yeah, I'm trying to get that focused in. I'm gonna get just a little sip of water. One moment. That's a little better, but also I'll give you a little background on my trail as I started looking at this. This was at the height of COVID. And I think it gave me a little bit of inside baseball, because I contacted this archive to see if there was a way that I might be able to look into this. And early on, they wanted to kind of know who I was. And I don't have any PhD, and I don't represent any, institution of that nature to begin looking at some of this data. But they were gracious enough to give me a short-term pass to get in and look at it. And the requirement is that you can't make any copies, you can't take anything out of there, it's all theirs. This was just a screenshot that I did, and I'll get rid of this after tonight, but I wanted to point something out along with what Dwight is saying. But anyhow, I did have some access to get in and look at it, but by no means what I found overwhelming was all these categories and thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. I think part of this is still being worked on to kind of get this in a process where people can get in and actually do some research on it. But Dwight, your question, this was one of the, just a sample of what a directive was, and this was April and May of 1939, and it says, will all observers ask the following question of someone whose view they think are typical of public opinion? And then there are two questions. And the first question here is, what is your forecast? This is what they would ask people. What is your forecast of what Hitler will do in the next 2 months? And then two, has anything in the news recently decided you to take more active steps in ARP, national service, or some other form of preparation for possible emergency? What that caught my eye was to say, okay, here's this directive. I'll go out and ask somebody that you think, would be ideal. That's not the scientific method. But then again, if you're asking somebody some questions about war, about going into the service, you're not going to necessarily ask women or children or someone that's in tough shape. So there's that behind it as well. And then they finally, in their directive, they say, give the age and sex and occupation of the persons asked, and also the date on which the questions were asked. Send the answers in immediately, then ask the question of a different person each week, and day by day at times when there has been some sensational news. Please send in the answers weekly. So that was the one thing that caught my mind, or my eye, was the fact that they were saying, here's the question, now find somebody you think would be, appropriate to give an answer to that. That may not be what we do. And then I just saw, just a week or two ago, I was reading through some things of some people doing, they've been reading this and making their own statements. It's almost kind of like a big long chat log or whatever. But there's this debate about how viable is this, and should they have done this and that technique or whatever. So there's a lot of teasing that out as far as how these were actually done and conducted and reported. Because you have a intermediate person overhearing a conversation and then going back and writing out what somebody said and then sending it in, so you might get a little bit of lost in translation there. But I think the overall volume, certainly outweighs that. The other interesting comment I heard is I listened to it was some sort of a seminar, and people were discussing mass observation, and a woman that is quite knowledgeable about the body of work here, what she brought up, and it really stuck with me. She was saying that the fact that mass observation got sole possession of these documents, forever, and the person writing this got anonymity, preserved those. And she gave an example that if someone were to die and they go into Grandpa's, office, and lo and behold, the guy had all sorts of diaries and letters or whatever, as they start going through it, probably the easiest thing to do is, boy, if there's some stuff in there about people that just shouldn't be said, that stuff is dumped. And, how many candid comments were made in personal diaries and writings that may be forever missing because of that. But here, when those were submitted and sent in, that became the property of mass observation.
In 1924, a number of academics got together to look at the lifestyles of Americans. The center of this work was in Muncie, Indiana, which was regarded as the most typical American city. And the feeling was that if you did a careful solicitation of information, you would be able to find out what American middle class life was like. I'm wondering if you came across that survey and whether it was of any interest to your project.
I would love to. I have not seen that.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting just to get in there. Like I say, I got locked out of that being able to get back in. And Sharon, running an archive, what do you think was going on there that I may not have had the credentials? I told them about the Kalamazoo Sports Club in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I don't think that overwhelmed them that I was doing a paper, but
it probably has to do with licensing. It probably has to do with licensing. All of this digital content, it's all licensed and priced according to all kinds of things that are way above my pay range.
Yeah.
I have three observations, which may be questions as well. The first is, I would question the qualifications for an anthropologist whose previous experience was studying cannibals.
Are any observers missing? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. And did he see cannibalistic type behavior? Was that a kind of bias? Okay. Another observation, somewhat more serious. How can you trust people in a bar? Don't you have to get the level of drunkenness? But I guess that's a rhetorical question.
No,
Uh,
they did note, you know, the intoxication levels of different people.
Good.
You know,
And then there's a question of, are you more truthful when you're really drunk or not? Okay, now this is more serious. I come from a literary background, and I tend to trust what I learn from poems and short stories and novels and plays and movies. And it seems to me that though that's hard to quantify, that's an a really important source of information. You might call it elitist, but was any of that factored in?
David, part of the diary group, was with schools, with elementary schools, and young children, and they'd have them write for MO, what is your life like, and I have a sister and 2 cats, and we have a farm and whatnot. So they wrote, the kids wrote these diaries of what their life was like, and one piece that I recall putting in the back of my mind is that when I mentioned that they would quasi-quantify some of this stuff by counting the number of terms and frequency, well, those they kind of combed for that as well. How often were pets mentioned and sisters and, and try to get some indication about the peace and tranquility and happiness of a family together. And, so they were drawing those conclusions from those documents. Yes. No, I think they were. I think they saw their primary task is that they were just out here gathering it, and we'll figure that all out as this stuff gets in. And my guess is that they probably haven't even really gotten a start on that. When you're talking about the drunk or not drunk, a quick little story. I won't be long with this, but a fellow told me this. We were flying one time somewhere with a newspaper. And he was relating another individual, so this was not him. But anyhow, the story that he was relating was that this guy and his wife were flying somewhere, and it was bad. And this is where they had to take their shoes off, glasses off, lean down, pillows, alarms going off. And they thought this is it. We're done. And the guy said, I got to tell you then, I have to be honest. So he confessed to his wife about some affair or something like that. And then it was kind of like, oh, ding, ding, oh, this is the captain speaking. We got the engines back up, so we will be. Then the wish was kind of like, oh, man, how long do you save that?
In a psychological viewpoint, I think the methodology of this has a lot to be said for it. It's not, quote, scientific, but the way they infiltrated the places and listened to conversations and, in a sense, got a little bit of a relationship with the people they were talking to, it seems to me a promising way to avoid the what is it you called it? Tell the pollster what you think they want to hear, especially if it was measured and put in context and evaluated and then tallied. And it seemed to me that was the biggest contrast between MO and what we see about, we are telephoning you to ask you, yes, no, what? Which is ridiculous. You're not going to get a real opinion out of anybody doing that, or even just exit polls at the polling places, which have been notorious for being inaccurate.
I think you nailed it, and I would see that theme frequently, and this goes back to this thing about not being seen as an observer, and they really had to work at that. It was even their accents and their clothing and all this as they tried to just simply be observers. They were trying to get as unfiltered as possible. to get the most genuine, sap they could from those kind of conversations. And like I say, then to go back later on and fill it in. But when that story came out about Neville, Chamberlain, and they were following that whole story, they really did see. I mean, there was huge support, which was very clear. I mean, the numbers were there, and they were doing regular surveys and whatnot as well. But then as that word started getting out, they were tracking definite changes in people's opinions and all that. But coming back to some of these, the other concept that I have with contrasting with today is that right or wrong, people develop specific attitudes, opinions, and beliefs, and those are actionable. Jeff, did you, or Ken?
Yeah, so you specifically called out the public's, or the British public's, understanding of Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler, which of course was subsequently revealed through actions to be not worth the paper it was printed on. And at the time, that would have most likely, I think, have been the most popular position to be favoring Chamberlain. I think his political, value at that point was very high.
Yes.
And then, obviously, he lost, Churchill became prime minister. And I think Churchill, even when Chamberlain went and made that agreement, was quite skeptical and was in very much the minority. But he was right. And so it's mistaken to think that necessarily the majority has the monopoly on truth,
right,
or what's accurate. But did they do additional retrospective looks at some other issues of the time is my question, because the one you mentioned with regard to the agreement between Chamberlain and Hitler is an interesting one. Did they find other issues that either confounded them as they look back on the public's perception of such issues, other issues at the time, or did they look into just where, through looking at these diaries, where were they getting most of their either misbegotten information or more accurate information?
Well, I don't have the answer to any of those questions. I do know they spent a lot of time on the abdication, the divorce, and how it changed or threatened their view of royalty. That was in jeopardy. That, oh boy, maybe this stuff is just all for naught or whatever. So they were worried about that relationship to the royals. But in the directives, there were thousands of directives. That's where they sent them out to look at specific issues. And if I could have spent more time in that archive, I might have been able to see a little bit more of that. Let me show you this. This was just a screenshot I took. And this I took from YouTube. This wasn't in the archives. This was just a piece about the mass observation. But the war begins at home. These are all the publications. So they did a number of publications where they gleaned material from the studies that they did. Then Grow More Food. These are file reports. That's just one. But the thousands of file reports. Worktown, that was the one in Bolton. Directive questionnaires, directive respondents, day surveys, diaries, topic collections. So you see here in these 6, I can't imagine how large of a database is behind each one of those windows. So probably if you were looking for something specifically, you could drill down and begin to piece that together. And maybe even on a particular topic, maybe it is how people reacted to people coming home with severe injuries, you can probably go take that question and go into diaries and go into directives and go into this and kind of search for that under each of those categories and pull something together. Jack? Oh, yeah.
Okay, just an observation, that letter that you had up there before,
Yes.
at the bottom of it, it had what I consider to be a leading question, which is part of what they were doing, and makes me question how they put it together. It says basically, if you had an increase in income, what portion would you put into savings, and what form would that savings take? That's a leading question. If you say, if you
Good
had
point.
an increase and you pay, what would you do with it?
Yes.
And let them tell you what it is. But I'm going to tell you, oh yeah, you want me to tell you about my savings? Okay, so it's leading in that way.
Oh.
And if that's an example of the kind of questions they ask, I have a problem.
But I think there's a whole science. I think there's a whole science to that, Jeff. Is that in the terms of writing survey questions, looking for that we might not even recognize it if we thought we were really crafting a real clever question. But if it's kind of leading someone on, or it just has a clue for what the right answer might be, boy, it's kind of hard to take that bias out of there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Jack.
Well, I was wondering if you could give some thoughts about if we were to repeat a study like that at this point in our history in this country, what would you learn? What lessons have you learned from what this did to make it work now, given the kind of situation we have with so many conflicting and unreliable sources? How could you improve the MO project if it were to be replicated now in this country?
If I were to take the ultimate step at that, is that I think the basic desire would be to really understand what people are thinking and believing and feeling. But I think what would have to transpire or take place first is that to be able to make those kinds of conversations possible. And as a matter of fact, I didn't want to get off a tangent with this talk. Oh, sorry. Too close to the mic again. I have copies of these books if you want to peruse through them as well, the ones that I reference here in the talk. But I think it was 1998, I picked up this book called The Argument Culture, and it was Deborah Henham that wrote this. And I think she's a linguist at Georgetown University or whatever. But at the time, I was also in the newspaper business, and I was having those same sorts of feelings, and I've heard those discussions about, about the news and people's attitude towards the news way back then. And what her point is in this book, as a matter of fact, I looked it up. There's one place, there's a paperback for $4.95 in this thing, but there's a lot of copies available out there. But one of the points she brings up is there's several elements to it, is that when we went from dialogue to debate, and even the terms that we just casually use, that, yeah, they're going to go toe-to-toe, or they're battle, this is a war of this. I mean, you hear all of those kinds of terms that are struck with this. And then the other point she made is that, and this is probably, a lot of it has to do with television, but if you had a television show and you brought in two economists to discuss the different aspects involved in inflation, you had these two economists discussing that's boring TV. And then the other they realized is that, and this maybe got played a little too much, that wait a minute, if somebody has an opinion, we need to show the other side of that, there are two opinions, to everything. And as TV started to come together in TV news, the more extreme both of those positions were, and they went at each other, the better TV it was. But that's where people were getting their information. We were from two extremes kind of hammering it out, and then now we see that it becomes personal, and it's not conversation at all. And the point is that, wait a minute, there's a relatively few people on the extremes of anything. What do the people in the middle think or have to say? And they're not involved in the conversation, and they don't make good TV. Jack.
A follow-up question then. My experience has been to get really close to what people are really, what's really motivating them, what really is the colors their thoughts and actions are peak experiences or bad or good throughout their life. And in order to get at that, I would think that something like the Story Project that NPR did for a long while would be a start. And one of the conditions in that would have to be that there would have to be at least some X minutes of silence from the interrogator to allow the person being interviewed to contemplate and reflect deeply on what the matter was that was at hand. Because my experience, and this has been borne out, I was told this, and my own experience has borne this out, is the longer you wait for a reply, the more profound the reply will be. And so a key thing I would say in anything that like we try to do now to replicate this would involve deep listening and patient listening.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And are you all familiar with the StoryCorps? Yeah. As a matter of fact, they spun off a couple of interesting projects, and that's where they'll put people from two different political points of view together to have a discussion. Yes. Yeah. And for me, this is my bias when I watch some of these news programs, and Joan knows it. I just don't think highly of these pundits on there, because these pundits have very clear, predictable things that they're stating are going to happen, and where, why, and how come, and when, and this is going to be. And when it takes place, it never materializes. But those people are on again next week, and it's on some other topic. And I just wish they had some sort of a rating, some organization that would relate the accuracy of their predictions, so that while they're speaking, they got a 1.3 down here. Now they're really good, it would shoot up to a 4.9, and you might listen a little more closely, and they might have an incentive to think a little bit more before they talked as well. But we're seeing a deterioration of this. And then a little quip here that caught my attention is this fake, not fake news, but this deep fake stuff, where they can literally take computers and mouth and pick up your own voice. They could take, with all the photos and the video that's available of Biden right now, and hours of Biden speaking, they could take that and animate that into a life form that you would swear is actually him, moving, swallowing, blinking, talking. But what if one of those were to get over to the Soviet Union, where they picked up this candid thing where Biden was saying to these people that, look, we have to fire first, because I think it's going to come, and if we don't, we have to have the guts to do this. If they put that in the hands of the Soviet Union and they're looking at that, it would be so believable. And then the other that I heard, this was just last week, that they're looking at now is, we've all heard of fact checkers. Well, there's now fake fact checkers. So, it just shuts all of this off, and back to this, you just can't trust it, Andy?
I had one thing to point out is after I've got a friend who's a statistician and an economist. So after the 2016 polling problems, you know, we just as a hobby we're trying to like figure it out, and we kept up on the news on that thing. 2018, their polling was actually pretty accurate within a statistical deviation. So it was they had figured out what they had did wrong on 2016, but then 2020 was wrong. And the current theory on that was actually the pandemic, because most of the political parties now is based off of education level. And the people who were home to answer the phone calls from the random dialing pollsters were the people who were at work from home, and not the essential workers and the lower educated people who were actually still out working at the time. So they were not actually home to answer the phone calls.
Sure.
So that's what they think now is that was the problem with the 2020 polling, was the fact that there was an oversampling, but nobody expected it to go that way.
Yeah. Well, and my last statement is, you know, when we talk about what could we do, there's been any number of starts with what we have here is a Torch Club, and Dwight knows the same thing, is to have venues available for people to get together for honest, friendly, straightforward dialogue. It may have to start at that kind of a level where people aren't just throwing rocks. I clicked in. It was on YouTube. There was a press conference that was going on, so I clicked on it, and it was live. It was going on. But my gosh, I thought, and I still may do this, I was watching these comments scrolling on the right-hand side. You would think these are like 4 and 5-year-olds, just nasty, you know, what on earth are they on a public forum making those kind of statements? And it's all behind, you know, it's not actually their name, it's, you know, Red Robin or whatever it might be. But if you look at this, it would really give you pause about what is the mentality that we're dealing with out there of people jumping to that for discord. So thank you for listening. Oh, thanks. Oh.
Again, thanks to Jim for another enlightening presentation. And we have about 5 weeks. We'll be back here again. And I did not look ahead to see who we have next month. Leonard. Oh, Leonard. Hydroponic plants. Yeah. Yeah. Hydroponic. Okay.